Hoo, hoo, hoo. All right, everybody. Welcome back. It is time to talk about Shanghai and COVID. I know it's been a little while and a lot has happened, but this is an important topic because we are really getting close to the end game here. And by that, I mean the end game in China, something people have been talking about for really close. Wow, I mean, 30 years if you go back to near Tiananmen, definitely 20 years when they saw how the economic model was developing in the 2000s. But now, with what's going on in Shanghai, with COVID, with the economy, with everything else, this is definitely the end game. So let me give you the bit of the background right now. So the big story in China right now is Shanghai. And Shanghai is really suffering. Before we get into that, let's just talk about Shanghai in general and why it really matters so much. Because Shanghai is not just any old city in China. It is, God, it's hard to overestimate, not to overestimate, to overstate how important Shanghai is to any version of China that is economically dynamic and prosperous. There is no such thing as an economically dynamic and prosperous China without a really successful Shanghai or a city right near Shanghai. So and Shanghai is the most dynamic city in China's most economically dynamic region, and it's been this way for thousands of years. And to give a sense of what Shanghai is really like, what role it really fills in China compared to the West and particularly the US, Shanghai is like New York and Chicago and Dallas and New Orleans and LA all wrapped in one. It is quite literally the hub for everything. And it has a very long history. Actually, Shanghai itself is only a couple hundred years old, but the city of Nanjing, which means southern capital, which is a bit upriver from Shanghai, that was the same story. It's always been the story. So I just have to mention again, Shanghai is not just a super cool looking city. It is really the city in China. It is the metropolis. The city of Beijing is something very different, which I've probably talked about in a different video. If not, I'll definitely do it. Let me know in the comments and I'll go through it soon because we are really running out of time to really do all this stuff. So, what is happening right now? Well, Omicron and the sort of slightly altered Omicron 2.0 is raging through China as we speak. And the Chinese government is desperate to control this outbreak because it has staked its legitimacy on its public health strategy. It looked really good in 2020 when it shut COVID out of the country, right? It lied a bit about the deaths and it lied about all sorts of things in the lead up, but it eventually did get a handle on the virus and booted out of the country. The big contrast between China and the West that developed because of that was something that the government really leaned into as the economics of China and its whole development model really started to show its age, to say the least, but really more like its faulty foundations. And the government needed to stake itself on something, and it really chose public health. And there's all sorts of problems with this, and it's very bizarre in a number of ways, but that's really not the key thing. The key thing now is that in Shanghai, because of Omicron, which is just so contagious, infectious. I mean, this is the most infectious disease I think we've ever seen since measles. It's more infectious than measles. So there's not really anything comparable to it. And the systems that China used and developed to originally knock COVID out and to lock down the country back in 2020 and to keep it out afterwards, this doesn't work for Omicron. And people want to know more about what China did early on, you should check out a podcast episode that I have called, what is it called? I think it's called Beyond the Quarantine. Yeah, Beyond the Quarantine. Check it out. It describes more of what really happened, what a lockdown in China really looks like. It's a very, very grim thing. And we're seeing that now in Shanghai. So getting back to it, Omicron is raging through the country. You can't stop it with the old tools you had. And then because China never really saw mass contagion, mass infection by COVID once 2020, halfway through 2020 was basically gone and it wasn't allowed back in. There is no widespread immunity to COVID in China. So there is there's a virus now raging through the country, and the people don't have any natural immunity to it. There hasn't been serious widespread previous infection that can lower some of the toll that this virus is going to take. And then finally, the Chinese vaccines are bad. They don't work very well. And they're not helping the country either. So really the only thing the Chinese government can do to stop the bleeding is a rolling series of never-ending lockdowns all across the country whenever you have COVID pop up anywhere. This is being implemented really from the top down because, like I said, the government has staked its legitimacy on public health. And the way the Chinese system works, the head honchos tend to set a major primary goal. So it'll be like GDP growth. And all the provinces and all the communist officials there, they get in on this new strategy and they just push it as hard as they can. And that is what we're seeing with COVID. That's the way it's been. And so that's really what is happening in China. It's a rolling series of never-ending lockdowns whenever some city finds out there's an outbreak. So this is as crazy as it sounds, right? This is quite literally the only Chinese strategy in perpetuity, and it is wreaking havoc on the country's economy, its manufacturing sector, its agriculture sector, and basically everything else. And not to mention the social costs of all of this. So what China does is it locks down a city. It does mass testing of everyone in the city, millions of tests. You see these really ominous looking buildings where there's just giant cubicle farms of testing sites. People are being shoved through it. There are people in hazmat suits and just totally dressed to the gills in public health infrastructure, just everywhere. It's pretty frightening. It's been like that for a very long time. And now with these new Omicron lockdowns, it is just spreading everywhere. And there's, again, no other choice because the only other option really is millions of people die and the government is humiliated and made vulnerable, which it can't really afford to let happen. So this is what we're going to see. And Shanghai entered the picture because in late March, lockdowns hit Shanghai and they've been really brutal. So Shanghai is a major, major port in China. It is 20% at least of the cargo that goes to the entire country. And this is for another video some other time, but if things were left to happen more naturally, Shanghai would be an even much, much larger percentage of these. Oh, wow. It looks kind of, how's that? Oh, it looks a little better. Okay. Shanghai would be an even larger percentage of the total cargo. It is it's the best place to have a port in China, basically. Enough said. Leave it at that. And all these other ports, Ningbo, which had lockdowns going back a while ago, all that, they are taking a bit of the Shanghai. The government is allowing Shanghai to lose a bit of its luster to spread the goods and the fat around. But it is extremely important. So because it's a port, because things are always coming in and out, this is where Tesla's major factory is. This is where this is where basically anyone wanted to put a factory in China if you weren't doing it in the Pearl River Delta. This country is exposed. I mean, this region is exposed to COVID coming in and out. There's almost no way to stop it. If you have a port, if you have major airports, if you're a major transportation node integrated in with the rest of the global economy, which is what Shanghai is. It is the most integrated city on mainland China to all the rest of the world. So this was inevitable. And these new lockdowns are turning into something far worse than the early status lockdowns we saw in China in 2020, which horrified the rest of the world, which we thought, a lot of people thought, this is never going to happen in the United States, it's never going to happen in Europe, blah, blah. And then variations of lockdowns happened, and there was a major blowback in countries with much more of a individual freedom, liberal individual rights type history than in China. And there's been all this back and forth in these countries about how things look or whatever. But in China now, these lockdowns are turning out far worse than even what we saw early on. The people have been inundated. The Chinese people have been inundated with all of these public health measures for years now. But what's happening in Shanghai is we're seeing the overall functional civilizational systems in China starting to strain. So there's rioting and looting and people starving across Shanghai. There's energy and food shortages, and they're popping up because the distribution system is buckling, right? You're trying to, how do you keep everything running when everything is locked down? It's just kind of like a catch-22. And that's really what China's facing. And businesses all across the city are suffering. And there's a lot to get into about this. The food system in China, is primarily it's about fresh foods in China, right? So 80+% of people are just they're not eating a lot of, frozen foods. They're not eating a lot of bulk dry goods and stuff. So you really need all this stuff to happen, not just in time, but it needs to happen. You need a constant flow of agriculture in particular. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of problems. You'll have perishable foods. you'll have food, perishable foods that perish, and you'll really struggle to make get your calories where you need them. So if you have all of your grocery stores shut down, if you have all of this happening, it really becomes quite challenging for people to survive. And this is the nightmare scenario that really people were worried about. How are things supposed to function? I mean, in the United States, in the West, we're worried more about social isolation, which has been really crippling for a lot of people and younger people and all of that. But in China, we are actually seeing the beginning of what really can happen when the actual functional pieces of the puzzle start to break down. So something like this could have happened in the United States in 2020, 2021, if right food distribution had really buckled, if energy problems had started, if all that kind of stuff had happened. It didn't happen, but this is where we are in China. And quite literally, people are throwing themselves off their balconies to end this problem, this life that they're living. It is really getting that bad. And I really should show a bunch of videos, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to get through this. And the worst part about something like this in China, when you get to this position in China, the psychology and the narratives start to run totally out of control. So right now you see dueling, almost cultural revolution style narratives in China and in Shanghai about what people should do and what they shouldn't do, what they should be willing to sacrifice. And it gets ridiculous. People telling other people not to go out the window and cry or ask for food because that could cause problems, or not to sing, not to do anything. I mean, it gets insane because there is a deep challenge when you're trying to integrate your personal, individual challenge and suffering with the broader problems the Chinese state is facing. As a single, young, successful individual in China, in China, and you're living in Shanghai, trying to figure out how you should act to support the government as it tries to maintain itself, this is a big challenge. And the ultimate way that this is concluded in China historically is basically the Chinese people have to decide, can the current ordered regime do what it needs to do? And if it's still the best option we have, probably better off just sticking with it. If not, if the chaos gets too bad, then all bets are off and things just start to break down. So we're really close to this edge in China, and it's, what we're seeing in Shanghai is pretty horrific, and it's not what you would expect to see in a modern city like Shanghai. In the United States, there's real challenges in New York with Omicron. I guess it was first the alpha version of COVID, and then I think it was Delta as well. And it was really horrible when you heard what was going on in New York and how people were suffering and dying in the hospitals and all that. But you didn't see this broader rioting, looting, medicine shortages, basic shortages of all sorts of goods, people throwing themselves off balconies. This is not what we were seeing in New York. So we're seeing now a Chinese equivalent later on that is much worse. And it's also not quick, right? It's not going to stop anytime soon. The Chinese authorities in the region extended the lockdown of Shanghai to cover the entire city indefinitely. There is no end. This is not 2 weeks to flatten the curve. This is going to go on and on because, like I said earlier, there is no other option. In the United States, there's vaccination. Primarily there's just vaccination. And the fact that China doesn't have that option. And just to be clear and kind of give some context, China could try and get the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines from the United States, and that would unfortunately not jive with its sense of global preeminence and how it's taken over the world and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of very difficult to do with its sense of who it is and its place in the world. But also, more importantly, right now, you need multiple shots, right? In the the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are basically generations out of date, and it would take months. First of all, they haven't bought them, but they would need to do multiple rounds. They would need to give it to over 1 billion people. This is just not in the cards, right? It's not on the cards, and obviously China hasn't purchased them, so it's just not possible. There isn't something there. Maybe in the background there is a new Chinese vaccine that is coming out. We will see, but the way it looks is that China looked good at the beginning of the pandemic because it was able to use its heavy state infrastructure, which is really a public security infrastructure, turn it into a public health mechanism, and that let it boot out COVID early on. but it wasn't the final solution to this problem. And what it actually did, what it turns out it actually did, is that it just backloaded the pain, right? So rather than overcoming COVID permanently, what China did is push out a serious COVID problem 2 years out. And that's what we're really seeing. And it's important that the West does see what's going on in Shanghai. The only reason that problems of this scale haven't resulted in widespread civil unrest is because Shanghai is wealthy and developed, and it's Shanghai, basically. The people are extremely educated. It's advanced. I mean, this is a first world city, Shanghai. I'm often talking about how much of China is not what people think it is, right? It's much poorer than you think. It is much less well educated than you think. The sophistication of its manufacturing, of its agriculture, of many basic infrastructure systems is not what you think. But Shanghai is different. It really and obviously is kind of what it looks like. Like I said earlier, it is the best place in China for anything to do with growth, development, prosperity. So it is. So it is exactly what you see. And this is also exactly what you see. But it's not just a Shanghai phenomenon, all these lockdowns. Like I was saying, right now, 87% of China's, 87 out of China's 100 largest and most important cities are all under some sort of lockdown. Some are more intense, some are less intense, but that's 87 out of their 100 largest cities. And again, it's really hard to overstate how big a deal this is. China's lockdowns earlier on and continuously through the last couple of years, they were already causing problems at its ports and other major pieces of its economic infrastructure, right? Various factories, assembly facilities. It was just literally, it's been causing problems all across the country. And now it is just everywhere, right? This was more localized before, and it was already causing huge problems for everyone in China, all sorts of businesses, both Chinese businesses, and more importantly, really for my audience and for people who are listening, this is causing problems all around the world for everyone who has any piece of their supply chain in China. And without getting too sensationalist, China's economic system is really getting pounded and is pretty close to buckling. And the world really is too, because only 6 to 7% of Asia to North America maritime cargo arrived on time in March of 2022. I know that's a random stat to just throw out. Thanks, Jason, for talking about whether the ships came on time. But think about it. The whole global system, the whole globalized economic system that we live in today is all predicated on things being able to get where they need to go on time. And China is the core manufacturing hub and production node in this giant system. It's where things from all over the world are brought to be assembled and then shipped out to the rest of the world. Yet, single-digit percents of those things are arriving on time. And it's been like this now for years. So all across the world, we're seeing people finally, and businesses in particular, not really people, businesses are finally starting to realize that this isn't going to go away anytime soon. And quite literally, with China doing indefinite, endless lockdowns, it is unclear how it could go away anytime soon. There is no way to pencil in and tell your investors or your customers or anyone who is going to listen that there is a end date for this. So people are really starting to see that things are changing, right? China's role in the global economic system is being destroyed. And the truth is, to make things even worse for people, the global system itself is also clearly being strongly tested and most likely also kind of being destroyed. With Russia on its way out, we can say confidently that the global system itself is kind of on its way out, at least the system that we've had since the 1990s. The basic point of the post-1990s world was basically to integrate Russia and China into this picture, right? That was the story. And that has now failed. Russia is out because of its expansionist, imperialist warmongering. So goodbye. And China is out to start because the government is pursuing public health policies that do not let it function in the global economy. And that doesn't even take into account what China wants to do to Taiwan, what it wants to do to its, what it might need to do to, what it will need to do to its own people, and what it is currently doing to people in Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang and elsewhere in the country. This is not 2019 anymore. And the difficult thing to sort of piece our way through is where things are headed. And it's obviously, if I talk about all this stuff, it just sounds like, well, it can't all be burning and being burnt to the ground, but things are really, really changing. And the story going forward for China is not going to be what you've heard in the 2010s or, well, yeah, basically in the 2010s. The triumphalist narrative, that's gone. The massive expansion, China's going to become the number one power. All this stuff is done. Just as an example, if Shanghai is locked down till June, it's no longer possible for China to hit its growth numbers. Not that it hits them anyway in any sort of real sense, but it's literally impossible. Cannot be done. Shanghai is, like I've said a dozen times now, it is that important. You can't do China. You cannot have a dynamic China without a functional Shanghai. It's crazy to people to think about this stuff, particularly Americans, where there's a very widespread base of economic opportunity across the country. That's not how it is in most of the world, right? Russia is centered on Moscow, and France, in a lot of ways, centered on Paris, and the British on London. All often a very outsized role, and particularly for capital cities. But in China, the economics is just centered on Shanghai. Like I said, it's a combination of a bunch of American cities. It is the jewel in the Chinese crown of modern China. Quite literally, Shanghai is the jewel in this crown. It is much better on a number of levels than Beijing, which is a political capital. It is something very different and very special and very unique. And there's no better place to see where things are headed than what we're seeing right now in Shanghai. We see our military personnel that are being trekked out into the country to start helping to maintain order and to continue the public health policies. There's fake statistics. It's very weird how you have millions of people getting infected and no one's dying, right? This is that same thing. Well, we said we were the best with COVID, so now people are dying again. Can't tell anybody about it. But you have that, and you have water and medicine shortages. There's ominous social media posts. There's suicides. And what this really is the widespread glimmers of true chaos in the Chinese style, and unfortunately probably at Chinese scale. So this is what I mean when I say that we're clearly headed towards the end game for China. Really dark, ominous flames are starting to appear on the horizon. So I'm going to leave it at that. It is a tough topic, and I think it really needs to be talked about more, and we need to give more context for these things. It needs to be part of a broader conversation about what Shanghai means for China, what China itself means for the world economy, and for what the world economy itself was meant to do since the 1990s, right? All of these things are interconnected. All of them are evolving, and I'm going to keep talking about it, but in other videos. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, comment, subscribe, send it everywhere, let more people see it. And there's definitely no better time to throw on notifications than now, because our world is totally crazy and it's only getting crazier. I haven't even gotten started talking about where things are headed, because it's going to be absolutely wild, and we all need a bit more information about where things are going. So with that, I'll sign off, and I will see you next time.